spokesperson, IDF. Thank you very much for joining me. Major, if I may ask you, how would you describe the current engagement of the IDF inside the Gaza? It's being reported by various portals, newspapers, that the IDF is at the gate of the Gaza city. Am I correct?
Well, ground operations are continuing and expanding every day. Certain different types of forces, of course, are involved in this effort, and the IDF is going after senior Hamas leaders throughout the northern part of the Gaza Strip, and we are continuing to strike them and make sure that they have no capacity to ever commit acts of terror against Israelis again.
What sort of resistance is IDF meeting inside Gaza? Can you take our viewers in India through that? How tough is this operation?
Well, we know that Hamas has ingrained itself and is entirely built within the civilian population of the Gaza Strip. Hamas does this intentionally with the understanding that civilian casualties in Gaza only helps their cause. And so we are making every effort possible to mitigate the impact on the civilian population. But we understand that Hamas has very little regard for their own civilians, which adds a level of complexity, of course, to the fighting within the Gaza Strip. And we understand that Hamas is operating deep within civilian areas. So that could include hospitals, apartment buildings, other places that are that should be for civilian use. And they are operating from these areas. So it absolutely is a reality of the fight against Hamas today.
Major, how difficult it is for a person on ground to distinguish between a civilian and a military infrastructure, because Hamas has been merging them. They have the tunnels beneath in a hospital. They will use a house, a residential area, and then they'll have their own offices there. So how tough is that for the IDF, which is a professional force, to distinguish the two?
Well, we make every effort possible to mitigate the impact on civilians. And that's exactly why last week already we have called for civilians to move from the area of fighting in the northern part of the Strip and to move to a safer area in the southern part of the Gaza Strip. Of course, the civilians are not our target in any way. And we know that Hamas is, of course, trying to keep civilians there. And we rely on various tools to be able to minimize the impact on civilians. And we think that Hamas needs to answer to the situation in the Gaza Strip, and Hamas should be making every effort possible to move civilians away from the northern part of the Gaza Strip.
Major, 17 soldiers have been killed in action inside the Gaza Strip. What sort of challenge your infantry is facing, where armor itself is being challenged through tunnels, anti-personnel, anti-tank missile? If I am correct, there was an attack on Nemer, which is a heavy armored personnel carrier, in which 11 soldiers were killed.
Well, first, our hearts go out to the families of those soldiers who died in battle. And it's important to emphasize that this is a war, and we are fighting a war against an enemy that has invested millions and millions of dollars in amassing the most advanced technological tools and weapons, and of course, rather than investing in the civilians in the Gaza Strip. And we understand that war is something that is terrible, and this is certainly not a war that we chose. But we understand that we have no choice, and we need to make sure that Hamas can never do this again. And that exactly is why we're operating.
And what sort of challenge are you getting from the tunnels? It is being reported that there's a phrase which is being used outside Israel, Gaza Metro, 500 kilometers of maze, 1,300 tunnels, built very differently, different from the one which were in operation in Vietnam. These are big tunnels, So how are you meeting that challenge? Because even Americans did not see such an intricate challenge either in Fallujah or Mosul.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up the issue of the tunnels, because I think it's a very clear example of what Hamas has done in the Gaza Strip in the last decade. And that is essentially create a city underground for their own use, for purposes of terror and for their own goals. And of course, it doesn't serve in any way the interests or the benefit of the civilians within the Gaza Strip. And this is entirely for Hamas to move weapons, to launch attacks, and to aid them in their goal of destructing Israel. So of course, it's something that we cannot allow to happen. And we do have experience. We are well aware that Hamas has used tunnels and has invested in tunnels, and it's something that we understand is certainly going to be part of the landscape, underground, so to speak, in the fight against Hamas.
Today, Reuters gave out the visuals. I'll show it to you, Major Libby Weiss. These are the visuals which were sent by the Reuters, and these visuals show, if we, thermobaric bombs were used on 7th of October. Let me show those visuals to you. Thermobaric bombs are which can create a temperature of 3000 degrees Celsius. How did they, and these were the weapons used against innocent Israelis on 7th of October. How did they get so much weapons? I just really want to know. As India has also seen number of terrorist attacks. We have been victims, whether it's Kargil war or 26/11, in which hundreds of innocent Indians died in Mumbai, or the Red Fort attack, or the Parliament attack. I as an individual, I have covered Parliament attack when they entered our temple of democracy. So how did they get so many weapons inside? I mean, to say, look at this must be tip of an iceberg.
Well, we know that Hamas has invested millions and millions of dollars in the last decade to amass the most lethal weapons that they can find to use against Israeli civilians. And we know that some of these weapons are developed locally, produced locally within the Gaza Strip, but we also know that they are getting weapons and have a long-standing relationship with Iran that is another source of these types of weapons that they have. And again, seeing the amount of investment that they have put in weapons to kill civilians in Israel rather than investing in civilians within the Gaza Strip is, I think, a double tragedy.
Coming back to the Gaza, let me play out. Coming back to the Gaza, I know this is an operational issue, but am I correct to say that? Because this was being reported by Times of Israel, army engineers have moved in to destroy the tunnels?
Well, I won't go into any specific operational details, I think, for obvious reasons. But what I can say is that the ground operations are continuously expanding and involve a variety of different forces who are operating. And it's a dynamic situation and one that is changing, of course, to address the threat.
And what's the ultimate objective? You have been saying that we will get rid of Hamas. But how do you do that? Because Hamas, apart from being a military force, is also an ideology, Major Libby. It's an ideology. If you translate the word Hamas, it's Islamic resistance, and their official ideology is to remove Israel from the map. How will that be taken care of? Because it's a military force, terrorist force, plus a violent ideology.
Well, I can speak to the military goals, and there's certainly questions here that go beyond the scope, of course, of the military, but around the military focus, the goal is to dismantle their terror infrastructure, to make sure that they never have the military and terror capacity to commit acts of terror against Israelis, and their terror administrative capacity. Beyond that is certainly something that on the political level will have to be settled. But from the military perspective, the goal is a very clear one, and that is to make sure that Hamas's terror leaders and those who are in charge of planning the events of October 7th and who continue to plan acts of terror against Israelis, and the administrative and infrastructure that they need to do that will no longer be at their disposal, and that they will never be in a position of power to attack Israelis from the Gaza Strip again.
Major Libby, isn't it very unique that Israel is probably the only state which is facing two non-state terrorist actors at both the fronts? Hamas in Deep South and Hezbollah in North. Both are non-state, both are terrorist organizations, and both are creating security issues for Israel. Don't you think it's a first for any country to face this sort of a attack by terror organizations?
But we unfortunately have a long history of having to deal with terror organizations that want to wipe us off the map. This is a reality of our lives here. And I think that there are other countries in the world that are also facing terror. Terror is not something that is uniquely targeted only towards Israelis. Unfortunately, there are many other countries in the world that have to deal with terror. And often they come from the same places and the same axes that support them. But we certainly are monitoring the situation along our borders very, very closely, and we will do whatever we have to do to protect our civilians.
And my last question before I let you go, hasn't this changed a lot of things for an average person who is interested in understanding military? People used to think that, a military action would all be about special forces. But what we have witnessed after Ukraine and Gaza is that infantry is in action, men and women on ground. And as a battle would get messy, as it has been in past, is all there. That era is not dead. It has not vanished. You require a standing army, standing infantry.
Well, certainly. And we are aware fully of the terror organizations and the countries operating in our area. And we unfortunately have to have a standing military. And it's something that we're grateful that we have in light of the threats that we face. And I think we all hope for a time when we won't need that. But until that time arrives, we absolutely need to defend ourselves and to defend our citizens and make sure that we can live peacefully and wake up in the morning and go to sleep at night and not be targeted by terror organizations that want to slaughter us in our beds.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Major Libby Weiss, for joining me.